Who has the first question or comment this morning? We don't have a microphone this morning, do we? Oh, we do. Thank you. Yes, we have. Jeff. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
You talked about your friend who said, you know, God's so busy, kind of, why is he thinking of me? And I know a lot of people have, I think all of us occasionally say, why me, Lord, why would you even consider me? And in my heart, I went, yeah, but like, this is King David. You know, so can you just kind of address that, little old me versus King David?
Yeah, the question was, okay, David, God's going to pay attention to David. He's David after all. We're not David. I think the answer to that is actually, I think you have to go back to the beginning of David's career. Because who was David at the beginning of his career? He was like the last guy Samuel thought he was going to anoint. Without getting into it too deeply, as a believer in particular redemption, if you will, that Christ did not die for like a mass of people that were unnamed and unknown. That he literally died for particular people, his sheep. He shed his blood for his sheep. He came to save his sheep and deliver his sheep. As I understand that, well, that's pretty amazing. It really is. I do believe this. I do believe that when Christ died on the cross, I do believe he thought of Joel Simon. I believe that. That being the case, I can't think of anything greater. I literally can't think of anything more important. I can't think of anything that explains the importance that God has placed in me than that. I can't. And I do believe that Jesus died for specific, for his sheep.
So among the elect is another place.
I believe that. Among his sheep. I think he does that. Indeed, let no one who waits on you be ashamed. You know, going beyond me, David. I think David was that kind of person who was very concerned with all of God's sheep. I believe you see that in good, honest civil magistrates, as David was most of the time. You're concerned with everybody, not just yourself. That's the illustration of the bad civil magistrate, or the bad king, right? The bad king is worried about maintaining his power. The good king is worried about defending his people. Yes?
Is that what you said to that young man? What did you tell him after he said that?
I just couldn't go that deeply with him. What I said to him was, if this God, I don't know how far I got, I really don't. He was raised in a Christian church, and pretty much just decided to tune out and been done with it. What I said to him was, but if this God can do run the details of the creation, I mean, think about it. All the little things he has to worry about. What's so hard to worry about you? I don't know how. I don't even know if that was such a hot answer. Maybe somebody else has a better answer. There's probably a lot of better answers to this thing than that. I've been working with him. He still will talk to me. But I'm not seeing a lot of progress yet. But maybe it'll take years.
You mentioned how the fear of the Lord is constantly connected with wisdom and knowledge in the Bible. How would those that want to discredit looking at God's law or trying to apply God's law, there a connection between that and fearing God?
Thank you, Jeremiah. The question, as I understand it, was, is there a connection between, well, let me start back a little bit further. Are there people that, well, two things. Deny that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and then having denied that, seem to have a problem with God's word and his law. Does that sound about right?
Almost the other way around.
Okay, say it again.
I mean, are there people that would not want to talk about God's law or think that has no application to us today? How can they then fear the Lord?
Okay, question being, how can people fear the Lord if they think that God's law has no application? Okay, thank you for clarifying. Did you see the quote from the back? It's not from Charles Spurgeon, I gotta tell you, that's from R.J. Rushdoony. We have the wrong right statement, the wrong person. The meek will he guide in justice, and the meek will he teach his way. And John's going to be teaching on meekness in the teaching time here. He will guide them in justice and teach them the way of life. The law is thus very clearly the way to a rich life on earth. There's no promise of any prosperity apart from the law. In other words, he's saying this: if the meek he guides in justice, and the meek he teaches his way, what way can that be, is what he's saying. Right? Well, what way can that be? If it's not God's law, what way can that be? Okay, let's take God's law off the table, because that's the Old Testament, and that was the mean God back there, but now we have the nice God who just loves everybody. Well, what's he teaching? He teaches his way. What way is that? How can we know that way? What way can it be? It has to be his law word. And to answer Jeremiah's question in a kind of a hard way, which is hard for me to say, but if you and I don't take God's law word seriously, we're not learning much of anything. He's not teaching us much of anything, because we are unwilling to learn. That's a hard thing to say. Because throughout North American Christianity, there is real offense towards God's law word. If you say that with some people, they want to throw you out. But what's God teaching us if it's not his own law word? I'll give you a quick example. That word law is just such a problem for some folks. I've heard teaching on Psalm 119, which is interesting. You don't hear very much about Psalm 119. Longest chapter of the Bible. We say we love God's word. Psalm 119 really extols God's word. And we hear very few, we don't hear that much about that psalm. We don't. And I've heard it done. Listen to sermons where it talks about God's law. And the pastor will read about something like, oh, how I love thy law. Or open thou mine eyes that I may behold wondrous things from thy law. Right? And it starts out law when it's read, but it comes out word somehow. Why? You know, it's like in the ear law and out the mouth word. Why? Why is that? You know, in discussing with some of my friends, I've asked them, I said, you know, they hate the idea of law. And I've asked them, I said, well, here's one for you. Husbands, love your wives. Okay, we don't like laws. Here's one from the New Testament that we're all comfortable with. Husbands, love your wives. Is that a law? Is that a law? If it's not, it's like a suggestion. Right? As far as I know, God's not in the suggestion business. Yes, Jeremiah?
I would think maybe the reason is because so many people have, I would think maybe there's such a disdain for that word is because so many people have maybe misapplied it, and I guess you can use the word legalism. People have been burned by misapplication, and they have a bad taste in their mouth, and so they throw the whole thing out.
Throw the whole thing out. Did you hear that? Some people may have a bad taste in their mouth. You know, what I found out about that is, and we don't have time to turn to it, but in Deuteronomy 4, which we read this morning, we did read the beginning of it. In Deuteronomy 4, God talks about his wonderful law and how if the nations look around and they see this law being applied, that they will inquire into this great God. We've talked about that before. The very first, I think, missionary statement in all the scriptures is in Deuteronomy 4. I believe that. Where God begins to talk about the conversion of the nations as they see God's wonderful law applied. And it is the worst of misapplications to take God's wonderful law and use it for our own ends and thus destroy the beauty of it and the power of it. But we love doing that, don't we, as human beings? Look what we're doing with marriage. Right? We're destroying marriage. Marriage is a wonderful institution. God gave it. We're destroying it through our misapplication and our perversion of it. How about this? Servant leadership in the home. Dads. Thing that I've been trying to figure out, I'm not any much closer to figuring out than I was a while ago. And John and I have talked about this. We've talked about this at home too. This problem seems to happen between sons and fathers. A lot of anger. Sons to fathers. Why? Well, it can only be because at some point we've broken down God's methods and God's ways and God's law word in the family. So what do? We say, well, the family doesn't work, so we're going to live together and not have any children. So that's where we start, right? Since the family has failed, we're going to come up with something else. And I believe that's what they do with the law. Since the law word is disgusting and I don't want it, we're going to come up with our own thing. And as soon as that happens, now we're not neutral towards the law anymore, now we hate it. Just like the people who want to redefine marriage, hate the real marriage, hate it, if that makes sense. I have time for one or two more.
Well, I think, like, is there a distinction there between the spirit of the law and the word of the law? That's just along the line.
Question being, is there a distinction between the spirit of the law and the word of the law? Perhaps thinking what Christ said when he got in an argument over the Sabbath. The letter kills, but the spirit gives life. How's that mean? Well, two things about that. First of all, we don't know, and this is the critical thing. And I know of cases where someone says, hey, I'm just going to love. And I'm just going to love. The problem is we don't know what the spirit is unless we have the letter. We must have the letter. Quick example of that, Good Samaritan. I would argue that the first two, the priest and the Levite, remember you had the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, right? And the question was how do you love your neighbor? Well, he was talking about that. And then the question was, let's get real specific. Who is my neighbor? Letter of the law, right? Jesus then gives an answer that has to do with the spirit of the law. But interestingly enough, I would argue, you can come back on me if you want on this, I would argue that the priest and the Levite thought that they were obeying the spirit of the law because they felt bad about it. One guy came over and looked. I'm sure they felt terrible. They might have known the guy. I feel bad. I would argue that throughout the scriptures, God's law word is all about doing, not about how we feel. And I would also argue that our present day culture says if you feel bad about it, you don't have to do anything. I believe that the spirit of the law is about what we do about the bad things, not about how we feel. If that's helpful. One more? Yes, Jonathan.
So, you talk about forgiving sin, forgetting sin. Is it possible to forgive sin and not forget about it, and vice not forgive sin, but yet forget that.
In other words, can we forgive and forget,
Yes.
or are we stuck with remembering?
Right.
Yeah, I would have to argue that it's very difficult for us to forget it. If you're a guy. Now, things are different. We all process these things differently. We've talked about these kind of things at home. Guys oftentimes get into a spat, forget about it, move on. Girls, on the other hand, often it's not quite the same. They remember who said what, who was wearing what at the time, how her hair was fixed at the time. It's just really different. But see, guys forget through negligence, right? It's no great merit that they forget. It's just they can't remember. I would argue it's very hard to forget. I think one of the reasons why we do remember, and this forgiveness thing is, I would argue, is not dealt with well. Because you hear people glibly say, well, you just have to forgive. Not understanding that depending on the severity of the offense, you remember it again and again, and every time you remember it, you must forgive again. I've been in that situation where it took me a long time to forgive. I thought, I just forgive, I'm done. No. The next thing I knew, that was in my head again. This great offense had happened to me. And you know what? It was my responsibility to forgive again and again and again. 70 times 7 at least, right? 490 times. I believe that's what that's talking about. And I got to the point, in some cases I really have a hard time remembering about it, but I can still remember some stuff. God can choose not to remember. I don't really know exactly how that works. It's not that he forgets, he's God, but he chooses not to dwell on it. I think that's where we need to be. And if we are still dwelling on it, we have not exercised forgiveness. That we know. We're still stuck on it. Have another question? Another question, anyone?